This is an article for day 8 about GitHub. I found it on wired.com, so you can go to this link to read it in context. I put the articles here on Google Docs so I can comment and students can as well. GitHub was intended to be an open software collaboration platform, but it's become a platform for much, much more than code. It's now being used by artists, builders, homeowners, everyone in between, entire companies, and cities. So I commented here that we're not just using this for programming. People are using it all over the world for a variety of different reasons. GitHub is doing to open source what the internet did to the publishing industry. Anyone can now change the data when new bike paths are built, when roads are under construction, and new buildings are erected. The city of Chicago recently announced. People are managing home renovation projects on GitHub. One law firm also just announced a couple days ago that is posting legal documents for early stage startup on fundraising on GitHub. Someone even published all the laws in Germany on GitHub last year. Perhaps not so surprisingly, he has about 17 open pull requests for changes. And of course, GitHub is still used by programmers and developers flying AR drones with Node.js or building websites with jQuery. So here with the legal documents part, I just put here that everything can be improved upon using GitHub. It's not an insult when you get a pull request. You can suggest improvements with these, and what's happening is our world is getting better one merge at a time. As people who were once just users become producers, they're reshaping the culture of open source. GitHub, I believe, is doing to open source what the internet did to the publishing industry. I even went so far as to say it's similar to what the printing press did for knowledge. Is creating a culture gap between the previous big project generation of open source and a newer, more amateurized generation of open source. The revolution will not be centralized. When most people hear open source, they think democratic, distributed, egalitarian, everyone building things together for everyone else to use. But that hasn't actually been the case. Most open source software has been created and maintained by a privileged and protected class of people. Professional developers who interacted with other developers that were a lot like them, though they were different enough to have arguments. Before GitHub, I spent a lot of my time thinking and talking about how to best manage open source projects because the coordination cost of an open source project was significant. So significant, in fact, that when a project did well and grew, a big enough community, it made more sense for the project to grow rather than fracture into smaller projects. But the bigger and more complex the software project got, the harder it became to contribute. So an assortment of members or committers were tasked with managing and producing the project. This often led to rifts between those producing and those consuming a project. GitHub closed this rift by making open source much more decentralized. It became less about the project and more about the individuals. The workflow for using GitHub is very personal. A person, and the author of this article is apparently named Michael on GitHub, has an account, and everything they publish exists one level below them. If someone else wants to fix something, and the person in control, let me just say this off the reading, if the person in control of that particular repository is not interested in your pull request, you can fork it, which puts a copy of that repository under your own account, and then you can do what you like with it. This workflow is very empowering. It encourages individuals to fix things and own those fixes just as much as they own the projects they start. It also gives all users an identity. And what I tell my students is this identity is so important that you can give your GitHub name to a prospective employer and they may hire you based on your history. So it gives users an identity in the new open source culture. GitHub is actually the #1 identity provider for peer-based production over the internet in more than just code. I've been contributing to open source projects for over 10 years, but what's different now is that I'm not a member of those projects. I'm just a user, and contributing a little is a part of being a user. Little interactions between me and the project maintainers happen several times a week on all kinds of little projects I use. And it happens even more often in the other direction. People I've never heard from send me little bits of code on all the projects I've published. As people who were once just users become producers, they're reshaping the culture of open source. And if you don't know by now, I'm a big fan of open source. So I'm going to leave the rest of the article. There's more interesting things to read, but I'll leave that to you to do on your own. What a great title, Decentralization as Democracy. And then one last paragraph I'd like to speak on. It says here, today a vast landscape of simple and understandable software is accessible to a creative class of people who did not have the depth of technical knowledge necessary to participate in the large open source projects of the past. Just by having a GitHub account and attempting to make tiny changes, attempting to use your creativity is powerful, and eventually who's to say you will not be able to gain this very technical knowledge. So GitHub, essentially what I'm saying is it'll give you the opportunity to take baby steps, and as many of those baby steps as you need to develop.